Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we have another special guest lined up for you, Mr. Adam Knapp, that is going to be joining us. Ken, why don't you give us an introduction into our guest, and then we'll get rolling from there.
All right. Well, on the show today, we have Adam Knapp, and he hails from North Carolina, which is, as I like to joke around, this is one of the most prophetic states in the country. There's a handful of states where prophets like to cluster, I guess. Texas is one. There's a few others as well. Tennessee's on the list. But anyway, so Adam's from North Carolina. I was introduced to Adam by a mutual friend at a conference, actually not all that long ago, maybe almost a year ago or so. And Adam walked up to me and he said, I hate it when people do this, but I have a word for you. And he gave me this word, and it was a good word. And we've developed a friendship since then. And I thought it would be interesting to have Adam on the show because I will say Adam's training in prophetic ministry is very, very dissimilar, unlike almost anything you will have heard in modern prophetic circles. We might say he's old school. But he's a very modern thinking, cutting edge guy. The hand of the Lord is with him. And especially because you heard some of the perils and pitfalls in our conversation with Jack Deere, I thought this would be a very interesting counterbalance to all that went wrong with one particular prophet. This would be an interesting counterbalance to talk about how we can build prophets, how we can take things out of them that need to be taken out of them, how we can put things into them that need to be put into them. And in my interactions with Adam, I found him to be just an incredibly quality individual. And I'm just really, I feel honored to have you on our show, Adam.
Well, thanks. It's a lot to have to follow Jack Deere and then on top of that introduction, but I'll take it. I mean, that's where we're at now is just south of Raleigh, a little town called Cary, North Carolina, Cary Apex. It's where our church is meeting, and so we've been in North Carolina for maybe about 2 years, and but we left from Florida, which rumor has it is another state where prophets gather. So I don't know that if I'm just following the East Coast trend or what that is, but I'm really glad to be here and glad to be a part today.
Well, you've probably got slightly less humid weather, if nothing else.
Just a touch.
Yeah. So, Adam, let's start with you and your story. You're a younger man, but you're still raising kids and kind of that time in life. When did you get saved? How did you get saved? And when did it first start to become apparent that you had some prophetic inclination and calling?
So I was raised in a family of ministers. Grandfather was a pastor, 5 uncles are pastors, and my dad was really what you would call, in that language, a house prophet, one of the people within the local congregation that was revered and honored as a prophetic voice and as an actual prophet. And so I was around that all my life, and from what I have heard as a little boy, there were little markings of the prophetic, as it were, but I don't remember these. I don't have any real connection to them. I got saved at 14. I had a dramatic encounter with the Lord, where I essentially I was in a place where I was try to put it together. I was at a youth group testimony service, right? And I had no desire to be there, and I wanted to be home watching football. And they kept ribbing everyone to get up and speak, and so I got up to speak, and I said, I don't want to be here. I think this is a waste of time. I want to be watching football at home. Mind you, my uncle's running the service. So I'm going to get whatever's about to happen is going to be dangerous at the end of this meeting. Mom's there, and I'm admitting that mom drugged me in. So I know this, but I'm mad and I don't want to be up there testifying. And so I was like, if God really needs to prove it, or otherwise this is a waste of time. I put the mic down and I make it about 10 feet off stage. And all I know is that he sat down in the room and I began to weep. And for about 4 hours, I couldn't stop weeping. It's one of the few times in my life, and it's probably shows you how much salvation work I needed. But when people crowd you at the altar because they just want to be a part of whatever God's doing, but it's a a you God thing. And this isn't like I'm not asking for hands laying. I want to be alone with Jesus. And so I can remember like throwing elbows at people, like leave, like something is here with me and none of you need to be a part of this. Get as far from me as you can. And I got genuinely saved. And it was within probably 3 months that all of a sudden I kept hearing things, right? And of course I had language for this. I was raised in a house where this language was used, so it wasn't weird. None of it was, everything was like, oh, Adam's following in the family trade. Like this is what should happen to him. And so I started having these little things, and I'll never forget. It was a Sunday morning. I'm sitting in service in the front row. Worship had like this pause in between the songs, which was common because you'd leave this space for prophetic, interjection. You wouldn't rush through sets. You sort of gave room for prophetic voices. And so there's this pause in the room, and I have like goosebumps and I'm shaking, like just shaking. But no one can see that. It's just me. I'm sitting in the seat just like, oh no. And my grandmother, bless her soul, she's still alive. She's 96. Mother's reaches over and smacks me in the leg and goes, are you going to give the prophecy or not? And I'm in my head, I'm like, first off, how do you know that God's talking to me? And like, I'm not sure that assault is the best introduction to prophecy, but like when your grandma hits you, you do what she says. And so I got up and I began to prophesy. And I'm terrified because my grandfather's present, my father's present. And I know that the moment I stood up and started to speak, they were weighing what I said, as well as the congregation was going, who is this new young voice? Because it wasn't, you didn't just whimsically decide that. And I always could blame mothers. I could always point at my grandma and say it was her fault. So worst case scenario, like grandma told me to prophesy. If someone's in trouble, it should be grandma. But that's when it began. And then from 14 to 18, I never gave another public prophecy that wasn't submitted to one or two senior prophetic voices, wasn't then critiqued afterwards, and how it was given, when it was given. All sorts of dynamics. And I went into a really hands-on discipleship that was aided by the fact that those men were also my father and my grandfather and one of my late uncles. And so there was a very organic approach to, as it were, a prophetic catechism or training.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
You said you had to submit the words you were going to give. I think a lot of people believe that if they get a prophetic word, they just have to just let it out there. You got to give it right now, however it comes. How do you submit a prophetic word to one or two individuals before you even give the word? Do you write it down? Do you record it? How does that work? What does that look like?
So there's a couple of different ways that initially it worked. So I wasn't very often giving like public words in the middle of a service when I first began. That was risky water. And it was risky water because there's a lot of places for the ego of a young boy to get inflated in that. And so like a lot of when I first started is I would go to prayer meetings with my dad and my grandfather, and we'd have like, I'll never forget, like we had this men's monthly prayer meeting, prayer breakfast. And the women would go over into the narthex and they would create like this amazing breakfast while the men prayed, and then we'd pray for each other. Well, in that presbytery like setting, it was open forum. That's what they were there for. And I had these senior prophets around me. And so I would lean over to my dad and say, so-and-so, like Brother Leo sits down, right? I remember Brother Leo Herzing, great guy. So he would sit down and say, hey, Dad, I feel like the Lord's saying da, 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 for Brother Leo. And my father at that moment would either go, yeah, that's the Lord. And then if he said, yeah, it's the Lord, he was going to say I should give it or not give it. Or he'd say, that's not the Lord, park it and listen, right? And so I had this first weighing of, is it God or not God? And then I had permission either to give or not give the word. So sometimes my dad would say, that's the word of the Lord. Now, it's not going to come from you. And so there was an understanding within our circle that the word of the Lord was not a private message that only you had access to. But instead, it was it's almost like the best analogy my dad used was a radio station. And everyone can tune into that station. And just because you're tuned into that station doesn't mean you're supposed to be the one that gives the word or the one that feeds into that thing. There are a lot of times that the greatest confirmation for me as a young prophetic voice was hearing the word of the Lord myself, not giving it, and then seeing a senior prophet give the same word. Because then I got to sit back and go, okay, I'm really hearing something because the big guns heard it. That's not just me making this up. And especially if we had no dialogue, which means I didn't tell them that's what I thought God said. So I have a double blind now. we're both hearing separately, not discussing one to another for a third party. Wow, I must be hearing the Lord. And so there was a lot of times where that was what Dad would have me do. Like, hey, good job, son. Attaboy, now be quiet. And so for people who are like, I have to give it, scripturally, they're foolish. There's no way around that. I mean, we could try to be nice with it, but that's just blatantly non-scriptural and completely against everything Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 12-14. The spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. If 2 or 3 of you get up to give a tongue and another one has an interpretation, or the other one sit down and be quiet. Like, this is, anyone that speaks that way doesn't read their scriptures. But beyond that, for me, I was raised where it was normative to hold, and that became this place of growing in confidence. And also of that spirit's witness within a community. It wasn't just one of us hearing God. There was 5 or 6, and then you'd have the follow-up. Like, I could come home with my dad and discuss what I held and say, hey, Dad, Grandpa gave this word to so-and-so. I felt that too, but I had this angle of it. Because that was the other thing we learned very quickly is you have facets like a diamond. Right. No one person has the whole story. And just because that was the other thing I learned, just because you have a new facet doesn't mean it needs to be given. Sometimes you just sit there and go, I have an insight into that, but that's not my place today, or that's above my pay grade. And those were things that helped you to grow.
Did you ever have the experience where in this prophetic presbytery environment, maybe I'll say you, but it could have been any of them, had a word, but it didn't really match what was going on with the other 4 or 5? And how did you sort through that to determine either A, it's not the Lord and it's just off track, or B, it is the Lord, but it's thematically not right at this time, and so we're going to hold it because it doesn't fit now? How did you work through that process?
So my grandfather had a little bit different of an approach. He was a bit of a wild, wild west. Let's just see what comes down the pike. But he had these ways of like letting the congregation know. Like, if somebody gave up and gave some like wide left prophecy, he'd be like, oh, brother so-and-so, bless your heart. Well, that was everyone in the room knew brother so-and-so missed. Because if that was the word of the Lord, Grandpa would say something like, that was the word of the Lord. And so like you would get these different, but it was never shut down. Now, we did have some where things got problematic and people had to be just like talked with, but we had, and this is weird, because I don't even know if you could do this today. And maybe it's because my grandfather was at the same church for 50 years, right? So you have this culture that's actually built over time, but the congregation knew. Like, it wasn't just the prophets that knew. Like, that inner witness, when someone would get up and just sort of shoot across the stream, as it were, or not mind the gap, right? They would go against the stream. Everyone in the room, like it would sound like, a chalkboard and nails, because they had been trained what the real thing sounded like. And so you would almost see people in the room, like all of a sudden heads would start moving like birds that were nervous because a predator was around. Yeah. And it was like, yep, that's the sign that the general witness of, you don't have old women with their eyes closed crying with their head. They're doing the, hey, who let the predator in? And when that happened, that was a really sort of for all of us to be like, okay, that person. And the worst part is sometimes people would recognize that and they would want to get better. Sometimes people would just be oblivious and they would think because they prophesied inherently it was something good. And that was always tough.
How did you evaluate if you had somebody gave a word where all the birds are looking around, to use your metaphor?
Yeah.
How did you handle it if all the birds are looking around, but it later proves that, oh, this was actually right, it was God? How did you test that? What I'm really doing in layman's language is I'm talking about alpha error and beta error. Statisticians use this when they're talking about testing data sets. So what about that one?
So ultimately for us, you didn't get the birds looking around, that response to a word that seemed out of place or out of season, because they were still the word of the Lord.
Okay.
But we would recognize that this word may not have context in this moment, or it may be something. And so that was always the old line of, you need to put that on the shelf. Yep. Pray into that. Let's say, look at that beta alpha error. Like, hey, we're not sure about this one, so let's put it somewhere safe, keep an eye on it. And then we would always go to this test: out of the mouth of 2 or 3. So if a man gave, and then for us, it was always out of the mouth of two or three, but you wanted one of those to be a blind, like someone who didn't know you, someone who wasn't in the service, someone who did not hear those original prophecies and would have no reason to prophesy in line with that. Because a lot of times people nowadays say two or three because they get three words at the same prayer at the same altar call. Like that's not two or three. That's two or three talking to you at the same time, hearing each other and going amen.
Right.
But for us, we meant individual, and usually one disconnected. So that's what we would do with a word like that, where you go, whoa, that. And the thing too is we had so many different prophets that came in, different styles of prophets. And so you would have some who are given to the more mystical or to the more parabolic language. And so you'd have to take those and be like, all right, brother so-and-so is a little strange, always been a little strange, but he's like a little strange accurate too. So we need to take that word and put it here. And, and then also we had a huge distinction between words of knowledge, words of wisdom, and true prophecy. So for us, prophecy was foretelling, right? Now we could get into foretelling and the prophetic element of preaching, but in the gift charismata dynamic, prophecy was always future. Word of wisdom was counsel for the present. Word of knowledge was revelation of the present or of the past. And so a lot of times in this conversation, it's like, well, how do you judge a word of wisdom? Well, is it practical and is it going to produce the fruit that it intends to give you? If there's wisdom from the Lord, it should produce. Word of knowledge, that it has to have already happened. Like that, we're revealing something you should know and be able to confirm. And so with prophecy, and that was a lot of what my grandfather operated in, future foretelling words, that was the other thing, time. Time's the great test of that word. Give it time.
Yeah.
Especially if time limits were put on it. Well, now we just sit down and kick the calendar on and go, okay, here we go.
Right.
And so that we expected the word of the Lord to come to pass. We guarded it. I grew up where we had a number of ladies who typed out every prophecy given in the church to every individual. You could go to Patty Bowman and say, hey, what's the word of the Lord about my life? And she'd start to rattle off to you prophecies that she had typed up for you and had saved in our church like files. And so like it changed the way, even like when you get into like a Graham Cook-esque, like what do you do with the word and how do you work the word and bring it to completion? That was a part of our thing that we recorded them and we gave them to you. You knew what the Lord had said about your life. And so that it was just a different tradition, as it were, much more latter rain-esque.
Right. I like it. I do. Because I like the idea of stewarding words, and some of them don't come to pass immediately, and you want to be sure you don't lose them or forget them.
Yep.
John Paul Jackson always used to say you need to write everything down. And, let's all remember as we're listening to Adam here that these women who are typing all this up were doing it on a typewriter or maybe a very basic computer, nothing like what we're all operating with today.
I remember when they switched, because you didn't think the prophecy was as anointed, because the typewriter just looked so much better as a printout prophecy than Microsoft Word did.
and remember as well that you couldn't, when we're talking about the files, we don't mean computer files that were stored on a disk or in the cloud. We're talking about literal pieces of paper in probably a manila folder in a filing cabinet. Yep. And so somebody could pull these things out and research them very quickly. By the way, this is just a totally tangential comment, but I learned when I was in business and I was coming up as a financial analyst, reviewing spreadsheets on screen, I would often miss mistakes that if I printed them out, I would catch them. And I had a boss who taught me this, and he remains to this day one of the two best bosses I ever had. But anyway, the takeaway from that simple vignette is that everybody should literally print these things out and look at them in writing, because you will see things in writing that you won't see if it's just on your phone or on your tablet or on your computer screen. All right.
Well, there's also something neat to throw to that. When you get into dark seasons or difficult seasons, having somewhere where you can go pull up the prophetic words over your life, like physically pull them out and just start to read them, and then all of a sudden you get taken back to those places where you got those words. There were many times that would be something where if my soul needed to remember, like, hey, soul, this is what we're supposed to be doing. It was beautiful to my own journey.
Yeah, Scripture there's a passage where Paul's writing to Timothy, and he says that you need to pay attention to the prophetic words given over you, because by them you can fight the good fight of faith. And so a lot of times people don't really take that to heart. You said something else really valuable too, Adam. I want to just be sure we underscore it or highlight it here in case people didn't catch it. So I'm just going to summarize, but feel free to elaborate if you want to do that. You said that prophecy isn't word of knowledge, and that isn't word of wisdom. You said prophecy is pretty much all future oriented, and word of knowledge deals with present facts and past facts. And I've taught this for years, and I always say, if you prefer to use the language word of data, that's what a word of knowledge is. It doesn't really have a foretelling aspect to it. And then a word of wisdom is God's wisdom for a situation. And it has that prophetic dynamic to it, but it's more of a now thing or something you're about to encounter. And this is how you'll need to manage it when you do it. This is God's mind for it. So this is really how these three gifts that often confuse people, prophecy, word of knowledge, word of wisdom, how they interact and interplay with each other. And this is how we kind of discriminate one from the other and distinguish them when we're dealing with it. Do you want to add anything to that? I just wanted to be sure we made it clear.
No, I'll give this one interesting thought just as an additional rabbit trail. But I had a man tell me one time, a prophetic guy, he said, I'm tired of people asking me for prophecy. He goes, so this is what I tell them. Do you want another prophecy, or do you want the tongue of the wise? And I remember it sort of struck me.
Wow.
But I began to realize something, that when we actually operate with wisdom, if you're actually operating in true spiritual wisdom, it should always have a prophetic element. And that's where we get into this discerning of seasons, times, the sons of Issachar. It's not just spontaneous, ecstatic prophecy. The tongue of the wise should be this natural outworking of, you bring a situation and it's like, well, I'm not going to tell you, I need you to prophesy all the details. And I'm like, no, like, you're sitting with a prophet who's given to the wisdom. Like, why don't you share with me? And I'm gonna let you know what the Holy Spirit says to me as you're explaining and unpacking. And there's a place for word of wisdom in a consultation type dynamic that I think the church is just missing massively, because they want everything. They want you to tell them their social security number, and rather than walk them through how to like make business decisions. And it's like, there's a flaw there in the way we think about the prophetic.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I'm actually thinking of the Apostle James at the Jerusalem Council. We don't tend to focus on him too much, but they're trying to figure out, what are we going to do with all these Gentiles who are coming in? What are we going to require of them? What are we going to tell them they don't need to do? And in the end, he says, it's my opinion, but James actually, he's a very wise man. And so you want to be listening to him. And we see examples of people like this in Scripture. Hushai the Archite, Ahithophel, these two in particular. You mentioned the sons of Issachar. Deborah the prophetess seems to have been an unusually wise woman. And I can remember, I don't know where I got this when I was a kid, but I remember Solomon prayed for wisdom, and the Lord said, well, because you asked for that, I'll give you what you didn't ask for. And for many, many years, I prayed for wisdom. I don't know if it did any good, but anyway, hopefully I got some along the way. But I learned the value of wisdom, and I'm often really grieved would be in the right zone, but I think I want to say saddened at the lack of desire for God's wisdom and true, profound wisdom among believers that I run into nowadays. They want the parlor tricks, but they don't actually want to know, how do I thrive in life under God's guidance? And that is just as valuable. It may be less impressive near term, but long term it'll be more impressive, I think.
It's an indictment on this generation and our desire for speed and for things to come quickly, that they prefer the jester over the king. And that's really the problem, is that we've got to a place that we want to be in the king's presence, but we forget that the jester is there as well. And we get distracted by the jester when we're in the presence of the king. And I think the reason we do that is because it's easier. It's easier to be entertained. It's easier to be brought into a place of laughter and fun and spontaneity than it is to get wisdom and direction and ultimately lordship.
Yeah. Wow. That's a mic drop right there on that one. Boy. Okay. So So you're in this process. You're a 14-year-old. This sort of the word of the Lord comes to you, and you're trying to learn what it means to submit yourself, and it's made doubly difficult because it's your own family members. And so
Yep.
if you really fail badly, there's going to be a conversation over Sunday dinner when you go home.
Whether I succeed or fail, there's going to be a conversation. If I speak out loud in service, we're going to have a talk.
All right. And you've got to, you've got to manage these relationships. This isn't just your church. This is your family. And you don't want that to fracture. How would we handle prophecy differently today if we really viewed church as family and we didn't want to see our family get fractured?
Oh, I saw the setup. I didn't see how you were going to land that one. So I was ready to go one way, and then all of a sudden you shifted at the last second. Well, there's a couple of things. And I mean, this question could be answered 5 or 6 ways, and all of them would be right. One of the first things that I think hurts us, and the reason that we don't handle things like family, is in family, we define who we are and what our roles are. They're either naturally defined for us. If you're the firstborn son, you're the eldest. If you're, wherever you might be, we understand birth order. If you're the father, the mother, we understand these traditional roles, right? Well, when someone gets outside of their role or outside of what they're supposed to be in the family, usually that gets nipped in the bud really quick. Now, I have 5 children. So if, my son, Eli, the youngest of my boys, decides he's going to wear the pants, it will not be long before Judah and Brooklyn let him know he's the youngest of the 3 sons. And they will let him know that his role is different, right? Now, that's natural. We see this in the animal kingdom. We see this across the board. Well, in the church, we don't do that. And we don't do that because we're too afraid of people leaving. And because our bottom line is really important to us, and our finances are important to us, and our comfort is important to us, we actually don't love people well. We don't confront them well. And we confront them when they become annoyances. We confront them when they frustrate us. We don't confront them to their betterment. We don't confront them when they're out of alignment. And so let's say Joe Blow starts prophesying all the time. Well, give it 6 months to a year, and all of a sudden somebody on Facebook calls Joe Blow Prophet Joe Blow. Well, now, guess what? He is the prophet of God. And he starts coming into church with a bit of a, look, I'm a prophet. Now, he's been prophesying for a year, trained by no one, has no legitimate understanding of the scriptures, can't even teach the word of God. He's disqualified from eldership in every way, shape, and form, but he's given a bunch of prophecies. Well, in a family, you tell little brother, hey, kid, grow up. We'll see you in a bit, right? You haven't even hit puberty yet.
Right.
Yet alone adulthood in this thing. You have prophecies that haven't even come to pass yet. Like you don't even have words that are long. That was one of the things that was interesting growing up with prophets. Is like, I remember one time my dad made a joke, Adam, I have a prophecy that took longer to come to pass than you are alive. So what do you say when someone says, I gave a word that was good for 20 years and then came to pass and you're 18? Well, okay, Dad, thanks. And I'll remember another time we came into a room, to give context, and I'll come back to answering this, but we're in a room. I have 5 or 6 young prophetic aspiring voices, some who are in the office, but maybe haven't been matured and developed well, others who are young and they're growing in their giftings, some called to the office, some not. My dad goes around, I'll never forget, goes around there and goes, how many prophecies have you given? They've come to pass. Answer me. One guy's like, maybe 5. Another person's, 25. Another person's like, probably 100 or 200. My dad goes, I am somewhere near 10,000. I need all of us in this room to understand that. What you think you know is not what you know. And I mean, I'm just sitting there like, all right, Dad, we're just going to but the importance of him going, hey guys, whatever you think you know, it's within a realm of maybe 20 public declarations or 100. But there are thousands that I've had to sit on. And that means countless people that came back with negative responses, countless people that said that this isn't the word of the Lord. You had to wait for the thing, right? So I say all that because when you have, I love this story, but this is, I guess, the best way with family. There's a story of an African state park that had rhinos that were goring their young elephants, right? Or no, the young elephants that were goring their rhinos. They didn't know what to do. Why are the elephants attacking them? They realized what they needed to do was grab a bull elephant and bring him in, because the bull elephant would teach the young elephants how to act. And they stopped goring the rhinos. because we don't do this as family, we have no bull elephants, we have no fathers. We're all disconnected. So there's no one that can spank me and tell me I'm wrong. There's no one that can tell me just to hold the word. There's no one that can tell me that I got too excited. There's nothing. And if you do, we also then pivot it with this thing, well, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown or among. So we start making that about our home church as though that's what Jesus is talking about. And we're like, see, their rejection is further proof that I'm anointed and called by God. And it's like, oh boy. Yeah, that's not good. And then you throw social media and they go, see, I made a social group and 30 people get on once a month for me to prophesy over them. See, I'm truly the called of God. And it's really hard to bring that person back in.
You have any commentary on this because you're a pastor and you have to deal with this all the time.
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's really hard to bring that person in is like the biggest understatement I've ever heard. It is extremely hard to bring that person back in. Yeah. You should come. Can I hire you to come to our church? Are you up for hire?
I don't know that I want to on a thing about the prophetic say, hey, yeah, sure, I'm a hireling. But I don't know that. Although that might match your last week, so it just depends how you play that out. But that was rough.
So good.
I've had to sometimes just tell people, hey, like, and this is where we've also, and like, let me speak to this generation and under. So the millennial and then the Gen Z. It's really difficult with Gen Z. I'm going to call spades. I don't care. And if you get emails in, sorry.
Okay. But tell us what's hard about Gen Z. Let's make it a teachable moment.
Yeah, no, they're emotionally brittle. They're the generation post everybody gets a trophy. So the moment you come to correct, especially because the prophetic is mystical, because the prophetic carries this you and God connection that is esoteric, right? None of us can see it and judge it directly. I can't be in your head as you're hearing the word of the Lord or in your heart. So by default, then when I come to you and tell you it's wrong, I'm not just assessing the word for many of this generation, this new generation coming up. I'm assessing your experience. And how dare I? Because your experience is the gamut of truth. And because you have no idea what postmodernism is, you just drink it down like Kool-Aid. And so, that's the difficulty with the generation is that they're not tough. And so by default, when I look at the way I was raised in the prophetic, most of them wouldn't be okay with it. They would. Now, listen, have I seen abusive things? Of course. Anytime men are in places of power, abuse can happen. But what they would deem abusive would not be what I would claim as abusive at all. What they would claim would almost be, well, I was told no. I was told no all the time. I remember one time I came home and I thought I had hit a home run. Like I pegged this traveling pastor and I knew it. They sobbed from 3 words in. I felt the glory. I know they did. I had the whole room doing the nodding, hey, and I was like, yes. And I get in the car and my dad goes, you really enjoyed the spotlight today, didn't you, son? And I just remember the whole thing. Just run home with my head down like, oh, it was about me and not Jesus. Oh no, I failed. Like I was so good, I failed even worse. Like I crossed a different threshold of failure. And so they would have a hard time, at least what I have seen. Many of them would have a hard time with that.
Let me ask you a follow-on question to what you just said. And I think this is a really apt point to ask it. And I hadn't planned to, but it just, as listening to you, it's coming to mind. What do you do with people that you're trying to discipline or correct, or use the word you want? I don't care. And you're using the scripture as your plumb line, and they say, I don't read the scripture that way. I have a different understanding. And there are a lot of books that are being released these days that supposedly are coming up with a new understanding of well understood doctrines. We've done some work on this podcast dealing with universalism and annihilationism. So people are, arguing about whether the scriptures really mean what they appear to mean. On the last podcast that Jack Deere was on, he mentioned homosexuality, and there are a lot of people wanting to reinterpret the passages that deal with homosexuality. So there's a whole gamut of topics that we could go after here. But how do you handle when you've got somebody you're trying to correct and raise, and you say, well, our benchmark, our plumb line is the word of God, and this is how we think about these things. And they say, well, I don't read the scripture that way, or that's not my understanding, or my Bible doesn't read that way. There's different ways people say it. How do you handle those kinds of people? They may not all be Gen Z, by the way. They may be
that's not a
they
Gen
could
Z
be
issue.
Gen X or
That's
Gen Y or
that
baby boomers. They could be
yeah,
anybody.
that could be the silent generation still kicking like that. That's human nature, right? So for me, let me see how I can tiptoe this. I do understand the desire for nuance around doctrines that maybe have only been seen from a Western light, or that have some questionable dynamics of how they put together certain logical fallacies or incoherence. I can understand all of that, right? But when we get into church conduct, my ecclesiology, how I expect the church to govern itself, right? That's different. And so for me, if you want to have a nuanced conversation about hell, fine, just live righteously. Like the end all be all, like if you're going to have some ridiculous take on hell, just make sure that you're not rolling the dice that you living like a fool won't send you there. Like I can do that, right? And that can be separate. That can be even scholastic. But when we come into like, okay, we're dealing with church and we're dealing with how we govern or disciple, that's our culture. And so when someone says to me, well, that's not how my Bible reads, okay, well, you're a part of a church that's how we decided our Bible reads. And so you have a couple of choices. You can yield to the decision of this body and how we've chose to govern ourselves, or you can kick rocks. But those are the choices you have. And I think, again, it comes back to this thing where, this is layered, but people, let's say, leave my church and go to Grant's church. Our general culture, Grant's probably not calling me to ask why they left, right? He doesn't even necessarily know they left. They may not even tell him they came from another church and they show up, right? Well, what happened? Well, they were coming into a place of discipline, right? And I may call it discipline. Someone else may call it whatever the case may be, right? Some level of correction. Well, now they get to Grant's church. They've rejected my form. Then Grant goes to bring it. They reject his form and they keep going, right? And because our churches are so independent and so broken up, there isn't a way to govern the wild ones the way they would have in the first few centuries of the church, where once your name got to a bishop's register, like once you crossed enough lines that bishops of cities were going, who's that guy? There was nowhere for you to go after that, other than to create your own sect and fight. But like you couldn't just bounce around town to the 7 charismatic churches until one of them let you prophesy whatever dribble you thought was the word of the Lord. And so some of that is our structure. It just is. For me, though, if you don't want to operate and operate within our view of discipline, then you don't get to serve and you don't get to participate. Not because, and here's my thing, I'll help you find a church that sees the scriptures the way you do, right? If you want to be a part of a gay affirming church, right? I think that's heretical. I don't think that's biblical. I think that's out of order, but I'll help you find one. There's at least 6 Methodists that voted that way in my region. So like, we can do that for you, but you can't stay here and participate in the community we're building, because this is our community's ethics, or this is how we've chose to build culture, and your views outside of that. And you don't have to leave. You can either yield or leave, but you don't get to stay here and cause rebellion or do the prophetic thing where I'm really the voice of reason in the house. No. Bye. Love you. God bless.
So this is an interesting intersection of church discipline and the prophetic, but it's something we don't really talk about with any granularity now.
They go together quite a bit.
Yeah. And go ahead now.
There's dynamics to this. So like if I were to look at the way I was raised in the prophetic, and while this level of feedback and submitting of words and this time of maturing and learning to prophesy is really valuable, I can also say that for most of the men, my father being different because he was my dad, so we had a very different emotional connection. For most of them, it was very non-emotional. It was very, and there wasn't necessarily a concern, as we're seeing in defense of Gen Z and the millennial. I'll come back to their defense a little bit. There's a value for emotional intelligence There's a value for like right conduct and how you lead and how you carry yourself. Whereas, this idea of just positional authority that was very 1950s-esque, that's the boss, whatever they say, whether it's right or wrong, that has I think, been rightly called out and challenged as a healthy way to operate. And so we have sometimes these maturing processes that maybe make you very effective at prophesying or understanding protocol or honoring leaders, but they don't necessarily get your heart healthy. And so, and I think some of the newer models, some of the third wave models, are all about getting your heart healthy. And they don't teach you anything about like submitting to authority, honoring the church, how to be a good servant in the house of the Lord, how to not try to build an empire within his kingdom. They don't talk about any of those things, right? But they will tell you like, hey, have you had inner healing and sozo for that daddy issue you have? And it's like, there needs to be a real mending of like getting your heart healthy and working through trauma and maybe getting real therapy or getting good inner healing, because there is good inner healing, and good inner healing is worth its weight in gold.
Right.
But bad inner healing is bad as a bad prophet. It's just, it's a mess. And so with that, you have that side. And then there also has to come back to a more of a latter rain form of that presbytery and that training and that raising up of prophets and that distinguishing between prophets and the prophetic. Like every believer should be prophetic. Few believers are prophets.
This is really good stuff, Adam. This is the perfect podcast to be having at this time in our sequence. Unpack for us a little more in our last, whatever we've got here, 5 minutes or so. What did you find you've already suggested it, but I just want you to unpack it more. What did you find got taken out of you? And what did you find got put into you by submitting to the process you went through, which again is very unlike that which many of our listeners would have been around? What were the goods? And it was all good, because some things needed to go. And some things needed to be poured into you and built into you. Talk to us a little bit about that process. I don't want to focus on what was wrong. It's very easy to poke holes in anything. I don't want to also make my statement previous as though that it was majority wrong. It wasn't. I actually think the process I went through is the best I've ever seen. I'm also not unaware that it wasn't perfect. It wasn't like the Lord himself mentored me. Right.
And so with that being said, some of the huge things, this ecstatic prophecy nonsense, where I have to prophesy because I get so overwhelmed. And I said this recently, and I upset someone. I said, the way that you talk about prophecy is the way Muhammad wrote the Quran. And that's a problem. If you're being overwhelmed and taken control of and forced to speak, we're not talking the Holy Spirit anymore. If you're losing the self-control, the fruit of the Spirit, we're not talking the Holy Spirit anymore. We're talking something else. We're talking your soul, maybe even something demonic, maybe some hybrid of the both, but we're not talking the Spirit of truth. And so that got dealt with really early. The pride, right? And again, and here's the worst part about the prophetic, and nobody wants to say this. That pride thing gets cut on more than once. Like that tree doesn't come down day one. And it doesn't come down year one. And year 10, all of a sudden you're finding there's a root source that's regrown and came off the side and it's getting cut on, because the prophetic inherently comes with a temptation to pride. And people respond to it in a way that brings forth your own pride. And so that is something this is why I think everyone should always have a voice in their life, because there's always something to get hacked on, right? And that's not of him. Another huge thing that was dealt with was this notion that I had the word of the Lord. Well, if it's a group of prophets and you guys are all pinging off each other, you this whole like I'm special side of it goes away, because you're like, no, I'm a part of a team of people that this is how the Lord uses us and this is how we work together. I think the coolest story, and I'll keep it quick, but I was with a kid who didn't really believe in the prophetic. He's sitting in the back of church with me. 6 ladies get up to give a testimony about going to, I think, Romania. Third lady's my Aunt Louise. I lean over to my friend. I said, the third lady, my dad's going to get up and he's going to prophesy this, 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 and this. And he's like, how do you know? I'm like, I just know. Third lady gets up, dad pops off the drums, walks over, prophesies, boom, boom. I still to this day don't understand it, but we did so much prophetic ministry around each other. I could be sitting there and my father could look over and snap at me because he knew I had the word of the Lord and I was sitting on it. And so there was this flow together that was really neat. And so because of this submission and because of a willingness to work with senior prophets and to see myself as under them, I was able to access things faster and develop faster. Because like the prophets that sat with Samuel sitting chief among them. And when Saul sent his soldiers, as you come into the presence of anointed, seated prophets, men that know God, you gain access to things you can't get to on your own because you don't have the clearance for that level of revelation. You don't have the history with God. And everyone thinks they're third heaven people, and they forget that like none of the disciples ever referenced it. Only Paul did. And so there's this place where it's like you get humble really fast. And so, yeah, those are some of the best things. Now, things poured into me. I was lucky to have because this is lacking. This is hugely lacking in the Pentecostal and charismatic prophetic circles today. My grandfather loved the scriptures, loved them, had 10,000 book library easy in his office, right? It was poured into me to study. It was poured into me to read the word. He sent me to Liberty. Like, that's not where you send a prophet. Like, that's the weirdest send ever. But he did that. He literally, his answer was, you have enough Pentecostal in you. Go get some Baptist. Like, okay. But what he was saying was, I need you to know how to handle the scriptures. I need you to know how to wrestle the word. And I think so much of the nonsense that's prophesied today would stop if people just read more. They'd realize you can't say that. That doesn't line up with the spirit of Christ. Like the Christian nationalism, the weird parts of NAR stuff that's not God and not the overblown nonsense. All of these little sects and things that get unhealthy, they die really fast with some healthy Bible reading. Like, they just don't hold up under the scrutiny of Paul and reading what Luke says and what Matthew says. All of a sudden you go, this isn't Jesus. And so that was huge. A love for studying the scriptures and for understanding the text was the other major thing. And I think ultimately what has kept me able to, as the righteous man in the scriptures, to keep getting back up again is the love of the word.
This is so pivotal. It's funny, when I was a lot younger, the Lord in an open vision directed me to go to seminary. And I was not enthusiastic about this idea at all. But I knew it was God. There was absolutely not one shred of doubt in my mind. Yeah. And I remember talking with Bob Jones, he's dead now, but the famous prophet, about this, because for a period of time I was somewhat close to him and under his tutelage. And I asked him, why do I have to do this? Why did God give me this word? And he said, because boy, it'll get you in the scriptures. Yep. And it did, and it did a lot of good for me. And I sometimes wish that I were more prophetic, but at the same time, there's a counterbalance that I have that I sometimes perceive as being missing in a lot of people who are viewed as prophetic. And
I would imagine when you travel, you actually have something to say, that if someone doesn't get a prophecy, they're still actually equipped and built up and not told a bunch of nonsense that has no scriptural veracity, which is what most of the traveling prophetic people do nowadays. They can't preach a thing that's orthodox.
Yeah, I hope so. I like to think so. I don't know. I preached in Grant's church. We'll let him be the
Grant nodded. Grant seemed to agree. He was okay with that assessment.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm just wondering how soon you can come back and join us again on this thing. This has been one of my most enjoyable
awesome
interviews that I think we've had in a long time, Ken.
Well, like I said, I knew that these would be, him and Jack would be great bookends. Adam, we are out of time, and there is one thing I'd like you maybe to just make a closing comment on, and maybe we'll have you back just to unpack this further. But
that's fine.
You made a comment about levels of revelation, and only Paul was a third heaven prophet. This is, I know all over the world, people's heads are exploding as they're hearing this. Give us a little more on that, because people are going to want to grab a hold of whatever it was that you had in mind there.
Well, okay. And I'm going to try to do this really fast, because there's one other thing I think you're going to want me to say in this, and I think I'll try to see if I can bookend it. One, if you really go through the New Testament, most of the great revelation is never given to prophets, it's given to apostles. So if we're talking about visions and dreams, you're going to have a hard time finding a prophet having them. But we'll leave that alone, and then we'll go a step further than that and see what actually happens here. This dynamic of levels or of authority, right? Not everyone is given to the same things. Not everyone's given the same measure of faith. We prophesy into accordance with our faith, right? Romans 12. So we understand this logic. But the other thing that we don't realize, and this is something, Ken, you and I talked about in one of our conversations with Kim, was how do you even know you actually are a prophet? Before we even get the levels of what that is, what are the markers, right? And most people don't know. And I gave 4 of them when we talked, Ken, and this was something I thought you might want me to hit on. So we all know the Damascus Road, right? Paul gets called on the Damascus Road. That's my personal, every person you meet at a prophetic conference has their God called me moment, right? So then the second one is, do other leaders, especially traveling leaders, come and minister and actually perceive that grace on your life? The evidence of this is when you have Barnabas seeking Saul out. He goes and finds him. After he does a PR job to help him in the beginning, then he disappears and he goes and seeks him out and draws him back to Antioch, right? You're at a conference, you're at a church, you visit Grant's church, and all of a sudden Grant walks up and says, I just sense the Lord saying there's this grace on your life. Now, everybody has these too, everybody, because we give those prophecies out at conferences now in ways we should never be giving them out to, but they're given out like candy. So there's the 2. The third mark, and this is huge that people always overlook, and this is what kills the rogue prophets. Did your local community lay hands on you and call you such? Right? That's Acts 13. That's Antioch. That's, hey, separate from me Saul and Barnabas, what? To the work of the apostleship. Like this, and what did they do? In prayer and fasting, they laid hands on them, sent them out. So that's that personal presbytery within your community, because they know your character. They know if you're ready for that. They understand your growth and dynamic. Then the fourth one in this, the third one upsets a lot of Pentecostals. The fourth one really does it as well. Well, then you have in Galatians, when Paul says, I went and presented the gospel I preached to those who I perceived to be pillars. Do the fathers accept you? Right? Because social media can accept you and you can have all your personal privacy and you can start your own church and say your church accepts you. Great. But who of status and who of reputation that actually carries the goods to make such a statement? What bishops, what overseers, what heads of ministry say that you're a prophet or you're an apostle? And when you ask that question, it gets really quiet. And you start realizing that this is why we have this issue with levels, is we have everybody thinking they're at a seat they're not even at, and then trying to access through mystical encounter things that they're actually not given privy to. And so they end up many times working out a very much a form of a Christian witchcraft rather than an actual sitting and receiving and listening to the Spirit of truth. They begin to conjure up and work and try to make things that if they would stay in their lane, wouldn't be an issue at all. So hope that was enough of a bookend for that answer, Ken.
Wow.
Okay, all you listeners out there, we'll be hearing more about all of this on a future podcast with Adam Knapp, but we are out of time today, so we'll have to land it there. Adam, it's been fantastic having you on. I'm so glad we got this done. Grant, you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I'm a little upset with you, Ken, that you haven't introduced me to him up until now and that we haven't hung more. So we'll talk about that offline. But other than that, yeah, no, this has been wonderful. I'm positive you'll be back very quickly because we'll have to do some cleaning and some unpacking of that. And we'll do that very quickly.
Sorry.
But I think
You don't need to be sorry. I love it.
It sounded awesome.
It's an important conversation we are having here. Very important.
Yeah, so needed. It's just, I know we got to unpack it. So Adam, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today. Ken, as always, thank you for taking time out of your schedule for talking with us. And thank you all for listening. And we will be right back here next week with another piping hot episode of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish.
Hey everyone, it's Julie with Orbis Ministries. As we reach the end of the year, we realize that some of you are in the habit of giving charitable donations. If the Lord prompts you to give elsewhere, we just want to bless you in that. But if he prompts you to give our direction, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description of this podcast. Thank you to everyone who would consider donating. We cannot do this work of ministry without your prayers and financial support.